Vedanta itself has almost become, I think, a word in the modern period for the philosophy of Hinduism, even though in the classical period, Vedanta competes with, in particular, a school named Mimamsa as laying out the fundamental principles of ethics and social organization for the religion that becomes Hinduism in modern times. So I don't know, when it comes to Shankara, there have been two major branches of interpretation of Shankara, and in one of those branches, a couple of other sub-schools, bifurcations in interpretation of Shankara. But it's in particular the branch of Adi Shankara, who lived around the 700 or so CE, that in Shankara, the interpretation by one of his disciples called Padmapada, and after him, a person named Prakash Atman, really took this sort of idealist strand of everything is real only insofar as it is the object of Brahman's consciousness. And that sort of radical idealism is not shared by the Bhamati branch of Vachaspati Mishra and Sureshwar and many others. And Shankara himself, I'm sorry, I really want to side with this Vachaspati branch, because Shankara says, look, there are emanations of the one. There is the one, and there are these metaphysical arguments for the one. Brahman is the one. In the beginning, there was the one. Some say, my dear, I think this is Chandogya Upanishad, that in the beginning, everything was nothing, and from nothing, all this emerged. No, but how can that be? How can something come from nothing? No, in the beginning, my dear, all this was just the one without a second. And so Shankara says very clearly, there's a material emanation, and then there's a emanation of consciousness, and they're different. I mean, I think it's actually wrong to think that Shankara denies the reality of matter. It's just a different emanation out of the one than the emanation of consciousness.
Okay, so
so it's a little bit like the school called Sankhya, and remember, Shankara is very much influenced by the practice of yoga. He uses yoga terms all the time, terms that appear in the Yoga Sutra, as do the Upanishads. The Upanishads seems to me to be first and foremost not metaphysical doctrines, but yoga manuals, how to meditate, and so on. And so Shankara, he promotes the idea that we should disengage from the material universe, but it's really I think, a misinterpretation of the original Shankara, the so-called original Advaita Vedantin, that the material world is Maya in the sense of illusion. It's Maya. He's much closer to Sri Aurobindo. Sri Aurobindo, interprets Maya. The word Maya, it occurs in the Bhagavad Gita and a few places in the Upanishads themselves. But Sri Aurobindo rightly sees that word is derived from the Sanskrit root ma, which has cognate with English measure, and it means to delimit. So any emanation out of the one into finite form, nama rupa, involves Maya in that there is delimitation. But Shankara, like Sri Aurobindo, is basically a theist, a um, I mean, not a Western theist that shapes a matter or brings matter out of nothing. Uh, the universe, the material universe, comes out of Brahman. It's just that that's one emanation. Actually, I think there's 6 emanations according to Shankara. He buys into the kosha theory, right? There's the Annamaya, and the Pranamaya, and the Manomaya, and the Vijnanamaya, and the Anandamaya, and then there's the self. There's really 6 emanations of Brahman. And what he wants you to do as a yoga teacher and spiritual preceptor, Acharya, Shankaracharya, is disengage from the material. Not that it's illusory. I just think that's just, I mean, look, I know that's maybe even the standard interpretation of Shankara now. But in what I'm going to write, and I've already written some things on this, I'm fighting that, fighting that interpretation. Actually, there's a new publication coming out by Hackett, I'll call it, Philosophy of Religion and Vedanta in Nyaya. Yeah, and we show. I mean, Shankara endorses arguments for the existence of God. I mean, he uses Ishvara. See, I think sometimes the Japanese, who are so astute when it comes to Buddhism and provide the funding for Buddhism and so on, they try to make. I mean, some of the later classical Vedantins accuse Shankara of being a crypto Buddhist. They kind of make him into a crypto Buddhist. They don't. They don't want to acknowledge the theistic aspect of Shankara.
Well, if I can I continue with the question? Yeah, so I was wondering how Ramanujacharya and Vishishta
look, as a kind of salute to Karl Potter one time, they asked me to help with an encyclopedia on Ramanuja. So when I was in India, I sat down and started reading Sri Bhashya, Ramanuja's commentary on the Brahma Sutra. Now you have to understand the Brahma Sutra systemizes the philosophy of the Upanishads, and whereas the Upanishads are meditation manuals, poetry, they have a lot of jokes in them. Like what T.S. Eliot quotes, what the thunder said, 3 groups of yoga students come to Prajapati, right? And they practice yoga for a long time, and then they want an Upanishad to take away with them. And, it's the gods, the demons, and human beings. And each group, the gods come and Prajapati says, okay, I'll give you an Upanishad, duh. He just says duh. And the same thing with the demons. They ask for it, he says duh, and the humans duh. And of course it gets interpreted in different ways. The gods understand damyata, control yourselves. The gods party all the time, and so they need to control themselves. The demons, diyadvam, they interpret as have compassion, because demons are very selfish. And humans, datta, give, karma yoga. You should give instead of take. So I mean, that's the Upanishads. It's it's aphoristic, parables, and so on. The Brahma Sutra packages the abstract claims of the Upanishads into a system of metaphysics and ethics and theory of knowledge that competes with other systems of philosophy that were emerging at the time, Buddhist, Jaina, but also within the Vedic umbrella, Nyaya, Vaisheshika, and so on. And so the Brahma Sutra really makes classical Vedanta. And Ramanuja writes a commentary on classical Vedanta, and he wants to differentiate an interpretation of the Brahma Sutra, and of course the Upanishads as well, that's different from Shankara. But I think he's not quite fair to Shankara. I spent a lot of time, I used to think, oh gosh, Ramanuja is so great, at least he's a theist and so on. But I don't know, I'm not so sure. Ramanuja defends the Vedic rituals where Shankara is quite explicit that you give up all the Vedic rituals. You don't have to have anything to do
Yeah.
with caste or, you know, the sacred fire and all that sort of stuff. You know, you can leave the karma kanda portion of the Veda alone. What you need to do is meditate, discover yourself, and so on. And Ramanuja defends the connection with you know, the sort of the Mimamsaka part of the Veda, where, you know, you do all these rituals and caste is important and so on. So I mean, there's some things that are Ramanuja that, you know, I think he scores some points. He scores some points against Shankara when he has the argument that Shankara makes certain 18 Mahavakyas, great statements of the Upanishads, really important for Brahma Sakshatkara, for, you know, enlightenment or self-discovery, such as Tat Twamasi, thou art that, or Sarvamidam Brahma, all this is Brahma. And Ramanuja criticized me. He says, look, Brahma Sakshatkara, the enlightenment experience, is much more like perception. It's not the kind of knowledge that you get from understanding statements, even the statements of scripture, like the Upanishads. And he beat Shankara over the head over and over again. But Shankara never really says, he says, look, this is the way we have come to the understanding of Brahman intellectually. Intellectual understanding of Brahman is not where it's at anyway.
Mm-hmm.
You need to have, you know, true experience. Brahma Sakshatkara. Sakshatkara means immediate experience. Brahman.
Stephen, would you be kind enough to share all of your riches, sort of veering towards Sri Aurobindo and the mother? I know you have many.
Yeah, well, I seem so. Sri Aurobindo is. I mean, Sri Aurobindo, you know, here's one thing that's really wonderful about Sri Aurobindo. He was a Neo-Vedantin and he loved the Upanishads, but at the same time, you got to think of Sri Aurobindo as a yogi and a master of meditation and karma yoga and bhakti yoga. And I don't know of a single place where Sri Aurobindo mentions the Brahma Sutra. He's not. There's a chapter in the Life Divine called the Vedantic Methods of Knowledge, and the way I understand it is he really thinks the classical Vedantins lose it in splitting sort of scriptural wars among the various sub-schools, so as slinging, you know, one quotation in the Upanishad and they sling it back, and that, you know, they're into system building, right? They have, you know, this whole sort of, and he thinks that they lose sight of the deep message of the Upanishads, which is mystical, again, your yogic experience. And so he, in a way, you know, Vedanta, you know, I don't know, classical Vedanta, surely there's continuity with him because they're all reading the Upanishads and the Bhagavad Gita, right? And the Bhagavad Gita is maybe more important than any of the Upanishads. They're all doing this, right? But he's not really interested in how Ramanuja is interpreting, right? I bet there are not 5 mentions of Ramanuja in Sri Aurobindo's whole corpus. I haven't looked recently. Or Madhva. You know, they say all the 3 great schools of classical Vedanta, Advaita Vedanta, Shankara, Ramanuja, Vishishta, Dvaita, then Dvaita Vedanta. I don't think Sri Aurobindo cared much about that. I think he, you know, he's focused on the Upanishads and on the meditative experiences that are expressed in the Upanishads, and the Upanishads is kind of a yogic guide. So yeah, there's a big break, well, not only with Sri Aurobindo, but any sort of modern person, there's a big break in the sort of cultural background of interpreting the Upanishads with, you know, the people who write in Sanskrit.
Well, Sri Aurobindo was pretty clear, didn't he say, I have written philosophy, but I'm not a philosopher?
Yeah, Yeah, right. He didn't study Western philosophy very much, though I think he did read a lot of Plato. He does echo Plato, and I think early on, yeah, that's right. But he wasn't. He's a poet and a meditator, and he now he puts together his own system. And his own system is definitely influenced by Upanishadic and concepts found in the Upanishads and the Bhagavad Gita. But so far as the classical interpretations, personally, I don't want to say anything against the greatest person who's ever lived. But I do think in his early years in Baroda, he kind of bought into the standard interpretation of Shankara as a Mayavadan, as an illusionist. And there's this kind of, it's like Shankara in the Life Divine, which is one of the only philosophers of the classical scene that Sri Aurobindo mentions throughout the whole of the Life Divine. I think he mentions Shankara and the Buddha. That's about it. And I think he is kind of a straw man. It's like, okay, I mean, he's not giving you a historical study of the actual Shankara so much as he's fighting against the sannyasin spirit, that the world denying spirit that's captured a lot of yoga practice in India. He wants to champion Janaka, the king who was very active, but a realized yogi. And that way, you might want to say Sri Aurobindo is not really so much a Vedantin, but a Tantric. This is what the Tantric, I mean, in the classical period, it's the Tantrics who really open things up and, not so confined to these systematizations such as the Brahma Sutra and so on.
I think it's interesting, Steve, that Sri Aurobindo's coming out of this political awakening and really wanting India to powerfully rise and fulfill its destiny, and Mother India, Bharat. Right. And he sees the torpor and the
well, he was, Vivekananda was like that too. I mean, even though the Ramakrishna Math adopted Shankara as their official classical spokesperson. But Vivekananda is not like that. Vivekananda is extremely active and sort of tantric, right? I mean, chakric centers. Shankara doesn't mention chakric centers or kundalini. He's not into, it's the tantrics that are into this spiritual transformation. And in that way, there is a big divide between Sri Aurobindo and Shankara, he's after enlightenment and, as direct a route as we can get to true knowledge of the true self, which is Brahman. Whereas, Sri Aurobindo from the very beginning, he wants more emanation of, he wants the divine comes more and more into the world, transforms the world. So that transformational theme is in the classical context definitely tantric, not Vedantic. So anyway.
Yeah, so didn't he say that the two main foundations for his yoga were the Tantra and the Bhagavad Gita?
Yeah.
Those two were basically the
two. The Bhagavad Gita really makes, karma yoga come alive and bhakti yoga. Whereas Shankara, Shankara is Shankara's commentary on the Gita is just fabulously well written. But he does see karma yoga and bhakti yoga as secondary to jnana yoga. They're preparatory. They makes it better. You become better able to meditate by practicing karma yoga and bhakti yoga. Whereas jnana yoga takes you straight to the supreme. So, and Sri Aurobindo, and I don't think Ramanuja wrote a commentary on the Bhagavad Gita. Yeah, I don't think so. But in that tradition of Vishishta Dvaita Vedanta, you know, karma yoga and bhakti yoga become very prominent as practices. And by the way, when it comes to the Brahma Sutra, though, I'm sorry, there's not as much difference between Shankara's reading and Ramanuja's readings as you might think. For example, both have Shankara has one very interesting argument for the existence of Ishvara. Ramanuja thinks, well, you can't get at the right concept of the Lord by reasoning. So this argument, you know, it may be helpful, but you've got to listen to scripture first. But then both embrace theism. I mean, you know, according to one interpretation of the Mayavad interpretation of Shankara, he's not really serious about his theism. I think that's BS. He is serious. And then he gives what's called in Western philosophical terms a theodicy. What's the central problem of a theistic worldview? Well, Bertrand Russell said there are two main problems. One is, what's the evidence to get it going to begin with? You know, that you might want to say, well, in Sri Aurobindo's terms, there's mystical experience, but there's also certain metaphysical reasoning, and where he really is on board with Shankara, they have a very similar arguments. But then, in a defensive way, the main problem is, as Bertrand Russell says, evil. You know, looks like, as I don't know, the great Western philosopher Leibniz says, that this should be the best of all possible worlds. I mean, God's loving, God's all powerful, and all knowledgeable. So this should be the best of all possible worlds. Well, it doesn't seem like to be the best of all possible worlds. And Voltaire satirized Leibniz by writing Candide, where all these terrible things happen and they have Pangloss going around. Oh, but it's the best of all possible worlds, which is just sort of crazy. So how come this world isn't the best of all possible worlds? How come it stinks? And I mean, in many places it stinks. I mean, I think you can overemphasize that. And Sri Aurobindo, you know, he makes a big point about that. But the theodicy that Shankara gives is that the Lord creates, and there's a difference in pleasure of gods and human beings, and you know, different situations, and when you're born as a human being, animals and so on, according to your karma from, in particular, your last lifetime, but also, you know, a whole chain of lifetimes. So, I mean, so the universe is just. I mean, it's really sort of in the Christian terms, this universe is heaven and hell. You're paying, you are reaping the rewards of your choices that you've made in previous incarnations, and to some extent this one too. And Ramanuj gives exactly the same defense. I mean, word for word. I mean, the exact same concept. There are, you know, that is the classical Vedantan defense of evil that sort of gets Brahman off the hook for for the, you know, the less than seemingly less than perfect nature of this world. No, Sri Aurobindo takes this whole problem very seriously and comes up with a much better solution, right? Where, you know, there's this gradual unfoldment of levels of consciousness, and, you know, an integration of the lower and the higher and all that. I mean, and that the resistance of matter and so on. You know, that's not really in classical Vedanta. Sri Aurobindo is really a genius and groundbreaking. I mean, I don't know. and again, I don't, he does, you know, he doesn't buy that karma theodicy. For him, it's the progressive development of divine life. Just requires, you know, sort of airing out all, you know, the atavistic forces, as we have with Trump. bring him to light so that, you know, you can get over it, right? He has a very different idea. Actually, I think that may be a Western idea. It could be that he gets that from, you know, Heilsgeschichte, the Romantic period of sort of early 19th century, you know, Goethe, Hegel, you know, Wordsworth, Coleridge. Those guys had this idea. Oh, you know, Keats had this idea of soul making, that the world, this, you know, you're making us that you know, soul making. That's what it's all about. Was true.
Sounds a little like Trotsky.
But like who?
Trotsky. Like
Trotsky
things have to get worse before they get better.
Yeah. I got it. Yeah, that's right. That's in that. Yeah.
Do we have a goal that's Satchidananda? Is the end game that we become blissful in our evolution?
I was in his commentary on the Isha Upanishad. He's really rough on Shankara. He says, or what he thinks to be Shankara, and you know, and he says, you know, he's just, you know, he's world affirming, and he thinks Shankara is world denying, and he thinks that's really there's a really problematic verse or two in the Isha Upanishad where it says, Atmahana, these slayers of the Atman go to these asura, these demonic or devilish worlds or something. And Sri Aurobindo takes that as not only retarding your path to enlightenment, but retarding your psychic development, your development as you know, in soul making, right? What he later called the psychic being. But later on, that was early writing. You know, that was in the Arya, in the revision of the Life Divine. He's a little softer. He says, you know, if you want to, if your individual psychic entity wants to dissolve its progress, its formation of a sukshma sharira, a subtle body, a psychic body, back into Brahman, okay, that's great. That may be what, you know, maybe what Brahman, you know, you and Brahman worked that out. That's okay. But, you know, there are those of us who want this continual development of individuality, of psychic individuality, and the new heaven and a new earth. So, so there is really no, for sure, no, yeah, there's discovery, self-discovery, but that's not the end, right? It just keeps on going. And I think the real, I mean, in a metaphysical way, to sort of tie this back into a world view, and I don't think the classical Vedantins have it. It's beauty. It's the manifestation of, you know, TMP Mahadevan has this. I swear, he's great. He has the Advaita thing on beauty. It's like the reason the world exists is more and more experience of beauty and bliss and the circumstances other than the super cosmic in you know, in matter, in life, and so on. I don't know if I'm answering your question. I'm just sort of.
I'm just so delighted, Steve, because my question today was going to be Leibniz in the best of all possible worlds, and you nailed it. So you got mine in passing. As someone who hasn't spoken yet, I would like to open it up to, we have a number of wonderful people. If someone who hasn't spoken yet has a question, please unmute yourself and jump in. Bhuvana, you want to mention your mother's work?
Yeah, I was just going to say she's working on a trilogy. Two of the three have been published, and by the Chinmaya International Foundation. And this is the first one to come out was the biography of Adi Shankara, and then the second one was actually Ramanuja, that was most recently released last year. And then the subtitle for Ramanuja is actually The Great Integrator. And the third one, the one that she's working on, is of course Madhva, bringing together all three of these.
Great, the formers of the great classical sub-schools of Vedanta.
Right, right. And these are fairly exhaustive biographies. And since she's also a Sri Aurobindo scholar, there's a lot of parallels that she draws between works and writings in Sri Aurobindo, but also from where he draws. Both actually in Ramanuja and Adi Shankara.
Well, maybe I personally, I'd have to see that to be convinced,
For sure.
because it seemed to me that Sri Aurobindo wasn't very much interested in the Vedanta interpret. I mean, I think he read. I know that he read Shankara's commentaries on the Upanishads, or many of them, in particular the Isha, but many others. I think, but I don't think he really set out to read those so much as, if you buy the Upanishads in a bookstore, I don't know, in 1900 or whatever, it's likely to have Shankara's commentary with it, because it's like Shankara's Gita commentary is so much like a dictionary and lucid. Every word he gives a synonym. Dharma kshetra, kuru kshetra, samaveta, yutsava. He would take every word and sort of break it down, tell you another word, and tell you how the compounds resolve and so on. And for every verse, and it's like a tool like that. It's like a combination of a grammar and a dictionary. It helps you read it. But I don't think he sat down to read the treatises of classical Vedanta. Somebody'd have to convince me that he did. I don't, and now it could well be that there are echoes of Ramanuja and Madhva and others in his works, but that's because they too are responding to the Upanishads and the Bhagavad Gita. So it's not a direct link. It's just, it goes back to the sources. It goes back to the Upanishads and the Bhagavad Gita. It doesn't go back to the Brahma Sutra. There's no evidence whatsoever that Sri Aurobindo read the Brahma Sutra. In fact, it seems from what I read from that Vedantic methods of knowledge, and what is it, chapter 7 or something of the Life Divine, very beginning, he disparages the Brahma Sutra project of systematic metaphysics, in my humble opinion. Shankara's got this fantastic concept that Vachaspati, one of the major interpretive sub-schools of Shankara, gets right. It's called Anirvachaniya, which means it's impossible to say. And so Shankara is a, in my opinion, is a thoroughgoing theist when it comes to how we should look at the world. But he admits that we cannot understand how the world looks from Brahman's point of view. We cannot intellectualize the way things are from the transcendence perspective. There's a block. Now, but what we can do is we can know ourselves in a non-intellectual way, which is, by the way, that's the best thing that can happen to a person. That's a parama purushartha. But intellectual endeavors are just supportive of the mystic path. And it seems to me that Sri Aurobindo, he shares that with Shankara. He got some of that sort of, the You know, look, it seems like to me like the classical interpreters of the Brahma Sutra after Shankara and so on, they kind of lose this, right? They're spending all their time. I mean, you know, come on, it's really hard to write classical Sanskrit. I mean, you got to be, you know, a real scholar to know all this stuff. And the Brahma Sutra disputes all the views that had emerged at its own time, Vaisheshika, Nyaya, you know, 3 or 4 schools of Buddhism and so on. And Panini, quotes from Panini, the grammar and so on. So, you know, it's not just your ordinary sadhu or sadhak who's going to be so scholarly. And it seems to me, and I think Sri Aurobindo had this opinion, that the classical Vedantins were just, you know, too concerned with the intellectual nitpicking of you know, various points of doctrine, and we're losing sight of what's really valuable, which is the yogic and mystical teachings of the Upanishads and the Bhagavad Gita. And I think Shankara, even though he, you know, he was an incredible genius, and, you know, hey, it's really, you know, Shankara is so famous for preaching inaction and disengagement from the world, but the biography of Shankara, is, so far as we know anything about it, it's hagiography, a lot of it. He's an extremely active person. He's going all the way. He's going all over India, and you know, preaching and everything. And just, I mean, is writing action. You know, he writes voluminously. His Upanishad commentary, his Brahma Sutra commentary. Here's the great tantric guru Abhinavagupta, and this is around 950. And look, he's got his, if you could see, he's got his, this is supposed to be a painting by one of his immediate disciples. He's got his eyes rolled back in his head, but he's playing a musical instrument. There are women among his disciples. You know, other musical instruments, people are, you know, and Abhinava was a great poet as well as philosopher, and so and you know, emphasizes beauty and the sort of same idea of the world is created for beauty. It's also, my students love this. Back here in the back, there are 2 ladies with bong, which are a marijuana concoction. And so yeah, so I don't know, but so I don't think Sri Aurobindo read the Tantrics so much as Bengal imbues Tantrism. I mean, it's just sort of a cultural movement. You could, by osmosis, by the, you know, there's just a lot of, you know, so I don't think he was a scholar of classical Tantra. I don't think he read Abhinavagupta, for example, but he surely shares a lot of the same attitudes. I would, and this was talking about Aurobindo Basu, and I feel very honored. I'm going to give the Aurobindo Basu Memorial Lecture in Calcutta in November this next year, I think, if COVID's over.
I was just wondering about the connection with Sufism and Tantra, if there's anything.
Well, you know, Rumi, yeah, I mean, come on, Rumi lived in what's now Afghanistan, right around Kabul. Come on, that, and then, you know, there are these scholars like that say, oh, the Sufism, it's all out of the Quran and so on. I want to say BS. They got to be influenced by Bhakti and Tantra. I mean, they're just right there. You would, but look, I don't know. I'm just guessing. I don't really know anything much about those historical developments. But I do want to. What I wanted to say about Aurobindo Basu was that Aurobindo Basu emphasized over and over again that he thought of all the classical philosophies expressed in Sanskrit, that it was Abhinavagupta's tantric philosophy that was the closest to Sri Aurobindo's. He was a big fan of Kashmiri Shaivism and the connection. Not, I mean, for him, it's not it's not a matter of so much of influence. Maybe influence, sure, but discoveries, right? I mean, the subtle body is real. I mean, the Vedantas have this notion of a subtle body, but they're really, they don't want to talk about it very much, and it's something you want to get away from anyway. But it's in Tantra where you get the idea that you develop as an individual psychic being, though also it's probably, when it comes to intellectual influence on this score, it's the mother and the Kabbalah and Jewish mysticism. But so far as Sufism is concerned, to me, I just see that as, gosh, that was really close. That, that flourishes in India to this day. It's sort of the good side of Islam, to give my personal opinion. You would think that they would, draw from the surrounding bhakti and tantric practices.
I also want to emphasize that similarities between traditions and so on does not necessarily mean one thing influenced another thing, because you also have convergence, because the same two distinctive, like Leibniz and who was the other one? Newton.
Both invented calculus.
Yeah, exactly. They both I don't know, discovered / invented calculus, but it would be wrong to say like Leibniz influenced Newton or the other way around.
Absolutely right. I think that's the pertinent point.